The storm had been raging for 3 days straight, turning the mountain roads into ribbons of black ice and the world outside into a howling void. Sarah Mitchell stood at her kitchen window, watching snow pile against the glass in drifts that reached halfway up the frame. The old farmhouse creaked and groaned under the wind's assault, its timbers protesting like arthritic bones. She'd lived here for 37 years, ever since the accident, ever since the night that had hollowed her out and left nothing but a shell that went through the motions of breathing, eating, existing. Christmas Eve meant nothing to her anymore. The decorations stayed packed in boxes in the attic. The tree remained uncut in the forest. The lights stayed dark. What was the point? The world had taken everything that mattered, and she had learned that hope was just another word for the cruelty that came before disappointment. Her isolation was deliberate, chosen, necessary. Out here, 5 miles from the nearest neighbor, she could pretend that the rest of humanity didn't exist, that Christmas wasn't happening, that families weren't gathering around fires and singing songs that once meant something. The knock came at exactly midnight. A single rap against the wooden door, so faint she almost missed it under the wind's roar. Sarah froze, her coffee cup suspended halfway to her lips. Nobody came out here. Nobody even knew this place existed anymore. The road had been impassable for days. She waited, certain she'd imagined it, certain that loneliness had finally started manufacturing companions from thin air. Then it came again. Knock. One deliberate strike against the door, patient and persistent. Her heart hammered as she crossed the living room, her slippers whispering against the hardwood floors. Through the frosted glass panel beside the entrance, she could see nothing but darkness and swirling snow. Every instinct screamed at her to ignore it, to return to her coffee and her silence and her carefully constructed fortress of solitude. But something deeper, something she'd thought had died years ago, pushed her hand toward the deadbolt. The door swung open, and the storm rushed in with a violence that stole her breath. But there, on her porch, stood a child. A boy, no more than 7 years old, wearing pajamas so thin they might as well have been tissue paper. His feet were bare, blue against the white snow. His dark hair was plastered to his skull, and ice crystals clung to his eyelashes. He wasn't shivering. That was the detail that sent terror racing up her spine. In weather that could kill in minutes, this child stood absolutely still, looking up at her with eyes that seemed far too old for his face. "Please," he said, his voice cutting through the wind like a knife. "I need help." Sarah's mind raced through impossible scenarios. Where were his parents? How had he gotten here? Why wasn't he dead already? The nearest house was miles away, and no child could survive that journey in this weather, dressed like that. It defied every law of nature and reason. "Come inside," she heard herself say, stepping back. Quickly. The boy crossed the threshold with careful steps, leaving no footprints of melting snow on her floor. Sarah slammed the door against the storm and turned to face him. Up close, she could see that his skin held an odd pallor, not quite the blue-gray of hypothermia but something else, something that made her think of marble statues and winter mornings. His pajamas, she realized, weren't wet. They should have been soaked through, frozen stiff, but they hung on his small frame as if he'd just stepped out of a warm bedroom. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Thomas," the boy replied, and when he smiled, Sarah felt something crack inside her chest, something that had been frozen solid for longer than she could remember. "I've been looking for you, Sarah Mitchell. I've been looking for a very long time." The lights flickered. Outside, the storm intensified, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Sarah's instincts warred with each other. Every rational part of her mind was screaming that something was catastrophically wrong. Children didn't appear on isolated doorsteps during blizzards. They didn't know the names of reclusive strangers. They didn't stand in thin pajamas without showing signs of hypothermia. Yet here was Thomas, looking up at her with those impossibly ancient eyes, waiting for her response with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world. "How do you know my name?" The question came out as barely more than a whisper. Sarah found herself backing toward the fireplace, seeking the illusion of safety near the dying embers. Thomas moved into the living room with fluid grace, his bare feet making no sound on the floorboards. He studied the sparse surroundings with what looked like sadness, taking in the absence of decoration, the dust on the mantelpiece, the photographs turned face down on the side table. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that no 7-year-old should possess. "I know everything about you, Sarah. I know about the accident 12 years ago. I know about David and Emily. I know what Christmas Eve means to you, and I know why you've spent every year since then trying to disappear." He turned to face her fully, and in the firelight, she could swear his eyes gleamed with something that wasn't quite human. I know about the guilt that eats at you every single day. The room tilted. Sarah gripped the back of the armchair, her knuckles turning white. Nobody knew the details. The police report had been sealed. The newspapers had mentioned a tragic accident, a icy road, a family lost. But the specifics, the terrible truth of what had actually happened that night, she'd buried that so deep that sometimes she could almost pretend it had happened to someone else. Who are you? The words tore from her throat like broken glass. What are you? Thomas sat down on the couch, his small legs dangling above the floor. The gesture was so childlike, so normal, that it made everything else even more disturbing. I'm exactly what I appear to be. A child who needs help. But I'm also something more. Think of me as a messenger, Sarah. A chance. A door that only opens once, and only for those who need it most desperately. Sarah's mind reeled. Shock, fear, and something else, something that felt dangerously like hope, battled for dominance. She'd spent 12 years building walls around her heart, convincing herself that she deserved the isolation, that happiness was something other people got to experience. Now this impossible boy was sitting in her living room, talking about chances and doors, and she felt those walls beginning to crack. My husband and daughter died because of me, she said, the confession spilling out before she could stop it. I was driving. I'd had 2 glasses of wine at the office party. Just 2, and I felt fine, I swore I felt fine. But when that truck came around the corner, when I tried to brake, my reflexes were just slow enough. Just a fraction of a second too slow. They died instantly. The truck driver walked away without a scratch. And I survived to live with what I'd done. Thomas nodded, his expression unchanging. You've told yourself that story so many times it's become your truth. You've carved it into your bones and used it to justify pushing away everyone who tried to help you. Your sister stopped calling 5 years ago. Your best friend gave up 3 years back. You've made yourself into a ghost, haunting your own life. Because that's what I deserve. Sarah's voice cracked, tears streaming down her face for the first time in years. She'd trained herself not to cry, convinced herself that she'd forfeited the right to that release. They should be here. Emily should be in college now. David should be planning his retirement. Instead, they're in the ground, and I'm here, and it's not right. It's not fair. You're right, Thomas said quietly. It's not fair. But not in the way you think. He stood up and walked to the photographs on the side table, turning them upright one by one. David's smile, frozen in time at 43. Emily at 9 years old, gap-toothed and laughing. The family portrait from their last vacation together, windswept on a beach in Maine. Would you like to know what really happened that night, Sarah? The truth that the police report didn't include. Sarah felt her heart stop. What are you talking about? Thomas picked up the family portrait, holding it gently. The truck driver, James Morrison, had been driving for 14 hours straight that day. He'd falsified his logbook to meet his delivery quota. He'd taken caffeine pills to stay awake, but he was barely conscious when he came around that corner. His company knew he was breaking regulations. They encouraged it. The road conditions were terrible, and he was going 20 miles over the speed limit. The room spun. Sarah collapsed into the armchair, her body shaking. But the investigation cleared him. They said it was my fault. The wine, my blood alcohol level, it was just barely over the legal limit. The investigation was flawed, Thomas continued, his voice gentle but relentless. Morrison's company had connections. They buried evidence. They made sure the narrative focused on you. And you were so devastated, so consumed by guilt, that you never questioned it. You accepted the blame because on some level, you thought you deserved it for having those 2 glasses of wine, for not being perfect, for being human. Sarah's world was fracturing, 12 years of carefully constructed self-hatred crumbling into dust. The silence that followed Thomas's revelation stretched like a chasm. Sarah sat motionless, her mind desperately trying to process information that rewrote her entire understanding of the worst night of her life. The guilt she'd carried like a stone around her neck, the punishment she'd inflicted on herself through isolation and self-denial, all of it suddenly felt like a prison built on lies. But could she trust the words of this impossible child who'd appeared from nowhere on Christmas Eve? Why should I believe you? She finally managed, her voice raw. You show up in the middle of a blizzard, dressed in pajamas, not even cold, knowing things you couldn't possibly know. You could be telling me anything. You could be some kind of hallucination. Maybe I finally snapped. Maybe the loneliness finally broke my mind. Thomas set the photograph down carefully and returned to the couch. When he looked at her this time, his expression held an infinite compassion that made her chest ache. "You're not crazy, Sarah. And I understand your doubt. But deep down, you already know I'm telling the truth. You've always known that something about that night didn't add up." The police seemed rushed to close the case. The truck driver's story had inconsistencies. "Your lawyer advised you not to push back, said it would be easier to accept responsibility than to fight a corporation with unlimited resources. So you did. You accepted it because you were drowning in grief and couldn't imagine fighting." He was right. God help her, he was right. Sarah remembered those hazy weeks after the funeral, remembered her lawyer's uncomfortable face as he explained that pursuing the trucking company would be difficult, expensive, and unlikely to succeed. She'd been so broken that the path of least resistance had seemed like the only option. She'd wanted to disappear into her pain, and accepting blame had given her permission to do exactly that. "How do you know all this?" she asked, wiping tears from her face. "What are you, really? An angel? A ghost? Something else?" Thomas smiled sadly. "Labels don't matter much. What matters is why I'm here. Every Christmas Eve, I'm given one chance to knock on one door. One person who's lost themselves to grief and guilt. One person who still has time to change their path. This year, it's your door, Sarah. This year, it's you. Change my path how?" The question came out bitter. "You can't bring David and Emily back. You can't give me the last 12 years. You can't undo what happened." "No," Thomas agreed. "But I can offer you a choice. The same choice I've offered others before you. A chance to see what could be if you let go of the false guilt, if you stopped punishing yourself for a crime you didn't commit. A chance to step through a door into a different version of tonight." Sarah's breath caught. "What does that mean?" Thomas stood and walked to the window, looking out at the raging storm. "Right now, 5 miles down this mountain, there's a young woman named Rebecca Torres. She's 24 years old. She's a nurse. And she's driving home from her shift at the hospital, exhausted after a double because 2 of her co-workers called in sick. The roads are terrible. She's scared. And in about 4 to 5 minutes, her car is going to slide off the road into a ravine. She'll survive the crash, but in this weather, exposed in a wrecked car, she won't last until morning." Horror flooded through Sarah. "You're saying she's going to die? Tonight?" "In the version of tonight that you're living right now, yes. But I'm offering you a different choice. You can stay here, in your isolation, carrying guilt that was never yours to bear. Or you can take what you know, what I've told you, and choose to act. Choose to live. The old access road, the one you haven't driven in years, it's still passable with the right vehicle. Your husband's truck is in the barn. It hasn't been started in over a decade, but it will run. You could reach her in time." Sarah's mind raced. This was insane. Going out in this storm was suicidal. The roads were deadly. She had no way of knowing if any of this was real. Thomas could be lying, could be testing her, could be leading her to her own death. But something in his eyes, something in the certainty of his words, made her believe every syllable. "And if I do this? If I save her? What then?" Thomas turned from the window, and for the first time, he looked genuinely hopeful. "Then you get to choose what comes next. The guilt you've carried starts to crack. The isolation you've built starts to crumble. You remember that you're still alive, that you still have purpose, that David and Emily wouldn't want you to waste the years you have left drowning in misplaced shame. Saving Rebecca won't erase your grief, Sarah. Nothing can do that. But it might remind you that grief and guilt aren't the same thing. It might show you that you still have something to offer this world." Sarah stood on shaking legs, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Every instinct told her this was impossible, that she should stay inside, that venturing out would be madness. But 12 years of madness suddenly seemed like enough. 12 years of slowly dying in this house, convinced she didn't deserve to live, it had to end somewhere. It had to end sometime. "The barn keys are in the kitchen drawer," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. "If I'm doing this, I need to move now." Thomas smiled, and this time it reached his eyes, transforming his face into something radiant. "You're stronger than you know, Sarah Mitchell. You always have been." The barn was 100 yards from the house, but it might as well have been a mile. The moment Sarah stepped outside, the storm attacked with a ferocity that stole her breath and threatened to knock her off her feet. Wind screamed past her ears, carrying snow so thick she couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. She'd bundled herself in David's old winter coat, pulled on boots she hadn't worn in years, grabbed a flashlight that barely penetrated the whiteout conditions. Behind her, through the howling wind, She could swear she heard Thomas's voice offering encouragement, though when she glanced back, the house had already disappeared into the blizzard. The barn door fought her, frozen shut by ice and neglect. Sarah threw her shoulder against it once, twice, 3 times before it finally gave way with a groan of protesting metal. Inside, darkness swallowed her flashlight beam. The smell of old hay and motor oil filled her nostrils, achingly familiar. She hadn't been in here since the month after the funeral, when just looking at David's tools had been too painful to bear. The truck sat where he'd left it, covered in dust and cobwebs. A 1995 Ford F-250, forest green, with oversized tires that David had insisted they'd need for mountain winters. Sarah had teased him about his obsession with this vehicle, called it his midlife crisis on wheels. Now, looking at it in the wavering flashlight beam, she felt a wave of gratitude so intense it nearly buckled her knees. David had always taken care of practical matters. He'd been the planner, the one who thought ahead. The battery would be dead, surely, after all these years. She found the keys hanging on their hook by the workbench, exactly where David always left them. Her hands shook as she climbed into the cab. The interior smelled like him, that combination of sawdust and the peppermint gum he'd always chewed. A photo hung from the rearview mirror, the 3 of them at Emily's 9th birthday party, just weeks before the accident. Sarah let herself look at it for 3 seconds, let herself remember their faces, their laughter. Then she turned the key. The engine turned over once, twice, caught, and roared to life. Sarah nearly sobbed with relief. Of course it worked. David had been meticulous about maintenance. He'd probably put fuel stabilizer in before parking it, changed the oil, done everything necessary to ensure it would run years later. Even in death, even from beyond whatever veil separated the living from the lost, he was still taking care of her. The journey down the mountain was a nightmare painted in shades of white and black. The old access road was exactly as Thomas had promised, barely passable but navigable with the truck's 4-wheel drive and David's heavy-duty winter tires. Sarah gripped the wheel so hard her fingers went numb, her eyes straining to pick out the road's edge through the swirling snow. Twice she nearly went off into the ditch. 3 times she had to stop and catch her breath, fighting the panic that threatened to overwhelm her. She found the ravine 23 minutes into the drive. Fresh tire tracks veered off the road, disappearing over the edge. Sarah's heart lurched. She grabbed her flashlight and a blanket from behind the seat, then climbed down carefully, using trees to keep from sliding. The car had rolled twice before coming to rest against a massive pine tree, its front end crumpled, windows shattered. And there, slumped over the steering wheel, was a young woman in scrubs, her dark hair matted with blood. Rebecca. Sarah screamed against the wind. Rebecca Torres. The woman stirred, raising her head with obvious difficulty. Her eyes, unfocused and frightened, found Sarah's face. "How do you know my name?" "It doesn't matter," Sarah said, wrenching open the jammed door. "I'm here to help. Can you move?" Rebecca tried to shift and gasped in pain. "My leg. I think it's broken. My phone's dead. I thought I was going to die out here." Tears streaked through the blood on her face. "I was so stupid. I should have waited for the roads to clear." "You're not stupid," Sarah said firmly, assessing the situation. "You're a nurse who went to work to help people. That's not stupid. That's brave. Now I need you to be brave a little bit longer." Getting Rebecca up the slope and into the truck took 15 minutes that felt like hours. The young woman bit back screams as Sarah maneuvered her broken leg, apologizing with every movement. By the time they were both in the cab with the heater blasting, both women were shaking from pain, cold, and adrenaline. "I don't understand," Rebecca said through chattering teeth. "How did you find me? How did you know?" Sarah pulled back onto the road, heading toward the hospital in town. "Someone told me you needed help. Someone who knew things he shouldn't have been able to know." The drive took another 40 minutes. Rebecca faded in and out of consciousness, and Sarah kept her talking, kept her focused, drawing on reserves of strength she'd forgotten she possessed. They talked about Rebecca's work, her dreams of becoming a nurse practitioner, her family who'd immigrated from El Salvador when she was 5. They talked about loss and fear and the strange ways that fate worked. And slowly, as the miles passed, Sarah felt something shifting inside her chest, something that had been frozen solid beginning to thaw. When they finally pulled up to the emergency room entrance, Rebecca grabbed Sarah's hand with surprising strength. "You saved my life tonight. I don't even know your name." "Sarah Mitchell," she replied, and for the first time in 12 years, saying her own name didn't feel like an admission of guilt. "And you did something for me too, Rebecca. You reminded me that I'm still here. That I still matter." As hospital staff rushed out with a gurney, Sarah watched them load Rebecca inside, watched the young woman being carried toward healing and a future that almost hadn't happened. And she thought about David and Emily, about the life they should have had, the years that had been stolen from them not by her actions but by a system that prioritized profit over safety, by a driver pushed beyond human limits, by a company that had buried the truth. The grief was still there, enormous and permanent. But the guilt, the crushing weight of misplaced responsibility, was beginning to crack. Sarah drove back up the mountain as dawn broke over the storm. The wind had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a world transformed by snow and silence. The sky was bleeding pink and gold, each ridge and valley painted in soft light that seemed to exist outside of time. Her body ached with exhaustion, her hands still shaking from the night's ordeal, but her mind felt clearer than it had in over a decade. She'd saved a life. Rebecca Torres, 24 years old, was alive because Sarah had chosen to act, to believe, to step outside the prison she'd built for herself. The farmhouse appeared through the trees like something from a dream, smoke still rising from the chimney. She half expected Thomas to be gone, expected the whole encounter to reveal itself as a hallucination born from isolation and grief. But when she opened the door, he was still there, sitting cross-legged on the floor near the fireplace, adding wood to bring the flames back to life. He looked up as she entered, and his smile held satisfaction and something that might have been pride. "You did it," he said simply. "Rebecca is going to be fine. Broken leg, some cuts and bruises, mild hypothermia. But she'll recover fully. The hospital called her parents. They're on their way. She's going to have a chance at the life she's been building, thanks to you." Sarah collapsed onto the couch, suddenly aware of how completely spent she was. "It felt good," she admitted, her voice rough with emotion. "Helping her, having a purpose, mattering to someone. I'd forgotten what that felt like. I'd convinced myself I didn't deserve to feel that way ever again." Thomas poked at the fire, sending sparks dancing up the chimney. "Guilt is a strange thing, Sarah. Sometimes it serves a purpose. It tells us when we've truly done wrong, pushes us to make amends, to be better. But sometimes guilt becomes a habit, a comfortable familiar pain that we choose because we don't know how to live without it. You've been carrying guilt that was never yours to bear, punishing yourself for being human, for having 2 glasses of wine, for not being omniscient and perfect." "The truck driver," Sarah said, thinking about what Thomas had revealed. "James Morrison. He's still driving, isn't he? His company protected him. He never faced consequences." Thomas nodded slowly. "He is. But his story isn't your responsibility either, Sarah. Justice and healing are complicated things. You can't fix every wrong in the world. What you can do is choose how you want to spend the years you have left. You can keep hiding up here, slowly dying while your body keeps breathing. Or you can honor David and Emily by actually living, by taking the second chance they didn't get and doing something meaningful with it." Sarah looked around her living room, really seeing it for the first time in years. The dust, the darkness, the complete absence of joy or life. She'd turned this place into a tomb, a monument to her own guilt. David would have hated it. He'd been so full of life, always pushing her to try new things, to take risks, to embrace possibility. And Emily, bright burning Emily, who'd wanted to be a veterinarian and save every stray animal she encountered, who'd believed in magic and second chances and the fundamental goodness of people. They wouldn't want this. They would never have wanted this. "I need to make this right," Sarah said, the words coming from a place she'd thought had died. Not just for Rebecca, but for the next person Morrison might hurt. The next family that might be destroyed because his company values profits over safety. "I can't bring David and Emily back, but I can make sure their deaths weren't meaningless." Thomas's smile widened. "Now you're thinking clearly. The truth about that night is buried in corporate records, falsified logbooks, suppressed evidence. But truth has a way of surfacing if someone is persistent enough. You have resources. You have time. You have a reason to keep going now." The Christmas morning light streaming through the window seemed brighter somehow, full of promise rather than mockery. Sarah thought about the boxes in the attic, the decorations she'd packed away 12 years ago. About her sister who'd stopped calling. Her best friend who'd given up. The life she'd abandoned out of misplaced shame. "I don't know if I can do this," she admitted. "Take on a corporation, expose the truth, rebuild relationships I've destroyed. It seems impossible." "You drove into a blizzard in a truck that hadn't run in 12 years to save a woman you'd never met," Thomas pointed out. "You did the impossible last night, Sarah. Everything else is just details. The first step is always the hardest. After that, You just keep moving forward. Sarah stood and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape. Somewhere down that mountain, Rebecca was waking up in a hospital bed, surrounded by family, alive because someone had cared enough to act. And perhaps, in some way Sarah didn't fully understand, David and Emily had reached across whatever divide separated the living from the dead to make that happen. Through Thomas, through this impossible Christmas miracle, they'd given her permission to stop drowning in guilt and start swimming toward shore. "What happens to you now?" she asked, turning to find Thomas standing behind her, small and impossible and radiant with purpose. "I knock on another door next year," he said. "Someone else who needs to hear that guilt and grief aren't the same thing. Someone else who's forgotten they still have value, still have purpose. But I'll remember you, Sarah Mitchell. I'll remember the woman who chose to live." He walked toward the door, and Sarah felt panic rising. "Wait. Will I ever see you again? Will I know if any of this was real?" Thomas paused at the threshold, looking back over his shoulder. "You saved a life last night. That's as real as anything gets. The rest, whether I'm an angel or a ghost or a hallucination, it doesn't really matter. What matters is what you do next. Who you choose to be. How you honor the people you've lost by actually living instead of just existing." He opened the door, and morning light flooded in, blindingly bright against the snow. When Sarah's eyes adjusted, he was gone. No footprints marked the pristine snow on the porch. No trace remained of his presence except the fading warmth by the fireplace and the photographs standing upright on the side table. Sarah stood in the doorway for a long time, breathing cold clean air, feeling the sun on her face. Then she went to the phone, dialed a number she still knew by heart, and waited. Her sister answered on the third ring, voice cautious and surprised. "Julia?" Sarah said, her voice breaking. "It's Sarah. I know it's been a long time. I know I've been horrible. But I'm ready to come back. I'm ready to live again. And I need your help." The conversation that followed was long and tearful and full of tentative hope. When Sarah finally hung up, she felt lighter than she had in 12 years. She looked at the photograph of her family, at David's smile and Emily's laugh, and she made them a promise. She would find the truth about that night. She would make sure Morrison and his company faced justice. She would take the years she had left and fill them with meaning and purpose in life. Outside, the Christmas morning sun climbed higher, burning away the storm's remnants. Inside, Sarah Mitchell began the long process of coming back to life. A child had knocked once on Christmas night, and everything had changed. Not because the past had been erased or grief had been eliminated, but because guilt had been replaced with truth, and isolation had been replaced with purpose. Sometimes salvation comes in the strangest forms, wearing pajamas and knowing impossible things. Sometimes it takes a blizzard and a broken woman and a stranger in need to remind us that we're still here, still alive, still capable of mattering. Sometimes Christmas miracles aren't about what we get back, but about what we choose to do with what we still have. Sarah looked at the boxes in the attic and decided that next year, maybe she'd put up a tree. Not to forget, never to forget, but to remember that David and Emily had loved Christmas, had loved life, and would want her to find her way back to both. A child had knocked once, and though he was gone now, the door he'd opened remained. All she had to do was walk through it.